Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty major, actually, President Trump's executive order. And it's about dismantling the Federal Department of Education.
Huge.
Yeah, and we've got news reports, official statements, expert analyses, the whole works, so we can really try to figure out what this would actually mean.
Yeah.
Like if you were a parent or a student or just someone who cares about how the U.S. runs its education system.
Right. And we're going to make sure we do it without getting too jargony, too, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely, like clear and straightforward, so you can really get the heart of it.
Exactly. It's like a fast track to understanding what's going on.
Fast track, okay, I like that.
Yeah. And you know what else? As we were going through all this stuff, another thing really jumped out. It's the whole way the administration is dealing with immigration specifically. There are these legal battles going on about how they're using this really old law. It might seem totally separate from education, but both situations kind of show how this administration is using its power and dealing with like the existing systems, the courts and all that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so two big things. Executive power around education and immigration.
Yeah,
We'll unpack both.
absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, Department of Education. What happened?
Okay, so the big thing right off the bat is this executive order that President Trump signed.
Right.
And it's all about starting to eliminate the Federal Department of Education.
Wow. So he's like actually trying to do it.
He is, and it's not a surprise either. This was a big campaign promise, and it's something that Republicans have wanted for a long time.
Okay, so he's following through on that campaign promise.
Yeah, and the idea behind it is to give control of education back to states and local communities. That's what the order says, and it's what people like Senator Ted Cruz have been saying, too.
Okay, so like less federal government, more state-local control.
Exactly. And, when President Trump announced the order, he was really critical of how things are now federally. He said the U.S. spends more on education than any other country per student, and he brought up some stats that are kind of worrying, like 70% of 8th graders aren't proficient in reading or math,
Yeah.
and 40% of 4th graders don't have basic reading skills. So his argument is basically, we're spending all this money, but we're not getting the results.
Yeah, that's a big argument right there.
Absolutely.
And I remember he specifically mentioned how the department's discretionary budget has just exploded.
Yeah, without seeing better results for students.
Right, and just for anyone listening who might not be totally familiar with this budget stuff, discretionary just means the part that Congress decides on each year. It's different from like mandatory spending that's already set for things like student loans.
Okay, good clarification.
Yeah, and I mean, Senator Cruz, he was even uh, more direct, I guess you could say. He said the department has become a way to push these radical policies.
Right. Radical and extreme were his words.
Okay, strong words for sure.
Yeah, and just to be clear, on the legal side of things, we saw a lot of news reports and legal experts pointing out that an executive order by itself can't just dissolve an entire cabinet-level agency.
Ah, so it's not like that simple.
Not quite. It would take an act of Congress.
Right, right. And haven't we seen some pushback on that front too? Like Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats, they're not on board with this, are they?
Definitely not. There's major opposition there.
So even if the order can't just wipe out the department, could the administration still, like, make things difficult for them to operate? I mean, is that a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. They can definitely take steps to downsize it and maybe even kind of tie their hands a bit. And we've actually already seen that happening, right, with the Education Secretary, Linda McMahon. Her appointment was a clear signal.
Right, like her whole mission was to shrink the department, wasn't it?
Exactly. And she moved quickly on. That we saw reports about a massive reduction in staff. Almost half of the department's employees were let go.
Wow.
Yeah, and Secretary McMahon said it was all about cutting down on the inward-facing bureaucracy, but still trying to keep those essential supports for states and students. She did say the people losing their jobs would get severance packages, though.
Okay, so like a gentler approach to the layoffs, I guess.
Right.
But still a major change. Okay, but what about the people who are actually in favor of getting rid of the department? What are they saying?
So one of the main arguments we keep hearing from both Secretary McMahon and Senator Cruz is that this is about giving states the power to create education policies that fit their own communities.
Okay, so like tailoring education to local needs.
Right, because they're saying the federal system just isn't efficient and hasn't really led to better outcomes for students, even with all the money being spent. Secretary McMahon even said that for every dollar the federal government puts into education, 47 cents goes to just following regulations.
Wow, almost half.
Yeah, so the argument is that money could be used way more effectively if it went straight to teaching and learning.
Okay, so less red tape, more direct impact.
Exactly. And Senator Cruz's take is that this is about the federal government overstepping its boundaries. He says education should be a state and local issue, period.
Okay, so it's like a states' rights argument.
Yeah, you could see it that way.
Okay, but there have to be people who are worried about this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
What are the concerns?
Oh, tons of concerns. This is a huge change, and there are a lot of potential impacts. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, she said this is basically abandoning the federal role in making sure everyone has equal opportunity in education.
Right, and especially those students who need the most help.
Exactly. She's really worried about the students who might get left behind.
Yeah, and what about the money side of things? I mean, how would this actually affect school funding?
That's a big one. While federal funding only makes up about 10% of the total money for K-12 education, it pays for some really important programs like special education, Title I for schools in low-income areas, career and technical education.
Right, right. So those could all be impacted.
Yeah, and Weingarten said this could mean a serious loss of money for local schools. She said something like 1 out of every $9 could be affected.
Wow, that's a big chunk.
It is, and then there's the whole question of whether education quality would end up being different in different starts.
Yeah, like would some states just fall behind?
That's the worry. Some states might not have the resources to keep up without federal help. We saw quotes from critics who were concerned about that, and Denise Speck from Education Minnesota, she said the same thing. She's worried about whether states can really fill those funding gaps.
Okay, so lots of financial worries. Then there's also the whole question of what happens to federal student loans and programs like Pell Grants and Head Start. I mean, those are huge.
Yeah, and that's a big unknown. President Trump said those useful functions would stay and be moved somewhere else, but no one really knows how that would work.
So, like, who would take over those
Yeah,
responsibilities?
exactly. Julian Berman, who's written a lot about student loans, he's asking the same question. He's like, who's going to handle all this? So if you or someone you know depends on federal student aid, this could be a really big deal. It could change how you get those loans and what the terms are.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about for students and families,
Yeah.
for sure.
Definitely. But there were some other ideas being thrown around, too. Senator Rand Paul, he talked about using technology to broadcast great teachers online and making it easier to hire and fire teachers. He sees this as a way to move past the old way of doing things, which he thinks is bogged down by bureaucracy.
Okay, interesting. So, like, shaking things up, using tech to reach more students.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that some state education officials actually like the idea of taking power away from Washington. We saw a quote from one in New Hampshire who thinks it would let them use money more effectively to help their students.
Huh. So they see it as a positive.
Exactly. They feel like they could do a better job.
Okay, so it's not all negative reactions.
Nope, definitely not.
So where does this leave us? Where does Congress come into all of this?
Well, ultimately, Congress has the power to either get rid of the Department of Education or keep it going.
Right. It's up to them.
Yeah, and they also control the money. So we have Senator Bill Cassidy. He's a Republican from Louisiana, and he said he's actually going to introduce legislation to abolish the department.
Wow, so he's serious about this.
He is, but like we heard from Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats, they're totally against it. They're worried about cuts to teachers and support for students.
So this could be a real battle in Congress.
Oh, yeah. It's a huge partisan divide.
Okay, so we've got this push for executive action on education. Now, what about immigration? This whole thing with the 1798 law sounds pretty wild.
It is. It's a really old law, and the way the administration is using it with Venezuelan migrants has raised a lot of eyebrows.
Okay, so walk us through this. What is this law all about?
Well, the crazy thing is, it was meant for times of war, like a declared war with another country that's invading or attacking us.
Seriously?
Yeah, and think about it. It's only been used 3 times in U.S. history. The War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. And in that case, it was used for the Japanese internment camps.
Oh, wow. So it's got a pretty heavy history.
Absolutely.
And they're using this to deport Venezuelan migrants.
Yeah, and there are reports saying they did this even though a court told them not to, which is a whole other issue.
Oh, wow. Defying a court order.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It is. And legal experts like Lee Gellert from the ACLU, they're saying using this law here is completely wrong because there's no war with Venezuela. And U.S. intelligence doesn't think the gang they're talking about is even controlled by a foreign government.
So, like, the basic conditions for using the law aren't even met.
Right. And Gellert said this could set a really dangerous precedent. It could mean anyone could be labeled an enemy alien without any due process.
That's scary.
It's a serious concern.
Okay, so this law is being used in a way it was probably never intended for.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this court order situation, too.
Yeah. So a federal judge, James Bosberg, He ordered the government to explain why they seem to be ignoring a previous order to turn around the planes with these migrants on them.
Okay, so the judge is basically saying, hey, what's going on here?
Exactly. And he was not happy with the government's response. He called it woefully insufficient and said they were, again, evading their obligations.
Strong words from a judge.
Yeah, he's clearly not messing around.
Okay, so the government was supposed to provide details about these flights or use the state secrets doctrine if they couldn't share the info.
Right, and just so everyone knows, the state secrets doctrine is basically a way for the government to keep information secret if releasing it would hurt national security.
Okay, so it's a pretty big deal to invoke that.
Yeah, but they missed the deadline to do either of those things. So Judge Bosberg is like, I'm upholding my order while we figure out if this 1798 law is even legal in this situation.
So he's making sure things stay as they are while this gets sorted out.
Exactly. He's trying to maintain control of the situation.
Okay, so lots of legal back and forth. And then on top of that, there was all this strong rhetoric aimed at the judge, right?
Oh, yeah, it got pretty intense. President Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi both criticized Judge Bosberg publicly.
And pretty harshly, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Trump called him a radical left lunatic and a Democratic activist, which is interesting because reports say he was originally appointed by George W. Bush, who's a Republican, and then later promoted by Barack Obama, a Democrat.
So not exactly fitting the labels Trump's throwing around.
Not really. It seems like he has a pretty centrist record overall.
Yeah, and Attorney General Bondi, she said the judge had no right to even ask questions and that he was trying to mess with foreign policy.
Right, so there's this idea being pushed that the judge is overstepping his bounds.
Yeah, and this whole thing about attacking judges publicly, it's worrying a lot of people, right? I mean, one federal judge, Esther Salas, she actually lost her son to political violence, and she said she's afraid this rhetoric could lead to more violence.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought. And on top of that, there were reports that members of Congress and activists were publishing personal information about judges' families.
Oh, wow, that's taking it way too far.
It is, and it raises serious safety concerns. Then there was this whole thing with Elon Musk donating to members of Congress who want to impeach judges.
Seriously. So he's like getting involved in this too.
Yeah, it's become a very charged and complex situation.
Definitely. And it's drawing a lot of attention to the role of the judiciary.
Absolutely. And legal experts and commentators were quick to point out how important the separation of powers is in our government.
Right. Like each branch has its role.
Exactly. And they emphasized that the judiciary is there to check the executive branch to make sure they're not doing whatever they want.
It's about balance.
Yeah, and they said federal judges issue orders that affect presidential actions all the time. It's not unusual, and it happens under presidents from both parties.
So this isn't some new thing.
No, not at all. And they made it clear that if you don't agree with a court order, you appeal it. You don't just ignore it.
Okay, so there's a process for a reason.
Right. It's about respecting the rule of law.
Okay, so we've got these two situations, the attempt to dismantle the Department of Education and then this thing with the immigration law and the court order. They seem different, but is there like a connection?
Well, if you step back and look at the bigger picture, what we're seeing in both cases is the executive branch trying to push the limits of its power and challenging the normal way things are done, the institutions that are in place.
Okay, so it's about how far the executive branch can go.
Exactly. And the way they're using such strong rhetoric, especially the attacks on the judge, it really makes you think about the state of our political discourse and what it means for our democracy in the long run.
Yeah, it feels like things are getting more and more divisive.
It definitely does, and it makes you question whether the traditional checks and balances are still working as they should.
Yeah, a lot to think about. So let's do a quick recap just so everyone's clear on what we covered today.
Sounds good.
Okay, so President Trump has started this process to get rid of the Department of Education, which is a huge deal for how education is run and funded in the U.S. But it's not a done deal. There are major obstacles in Congress.
Right, and then we have this other situation where the administration is using this really old law for immigration, and it's sparked all these legal challenges and arguments about the role of the courts.
Yeah, two really important issues, and they both have a direct impact on all of us. Changes to education could affect things like school funding, curriculum, even federal student aid. And these legal and political fights about executive power, they affect the whole balance of power in our government.
Absolutely. It's about the fundamental structure of how our country is run.
Sure. So here's a final thought for everyone listening. The Department of Education was created to help the entire nation meet certain goals for education and make sure everyone has equal access to it. So what would happen if we took all that away and gave all the responsibility to individual states? I mean, they have different resources, different priorities. How would that change things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it makes you think about the whole history of why the federal government got involved in education in the first place.
Yeah, what was the purpose, and how has it changed over time?
And it also raises questions about how you balance giving power to local communities with making sure there are national standards and that everyone gets a fair shot.
That's the tension, isn't it? Local versus national control?
Exactly, finding that right balance.
Okay, so we've given you a lot to think about, but we hope this has sparked your curiosity. Keep exploring these issues. Maybe do some research on the Department of Education, or look into how federal funding affects your local schools. And as always, listen to different perspectives. Form your own opinions.
That's what it's all about, staying informed and engaged.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
Until next time.